Hey Saints, this is Kent once again doing another recap video for our Sermon on the Mount Bible study. This recap will be for the 8th week of our study. We actually spent a little bit of time continuing in where we left off last time, Matthew 5 verse 22, and really just the last part of it, Matthew 5:22c. Let me just read my translation of that really quick. And whoever says Mora will be liable to the fiery Gehenna. Now, we talked about that a good deal last time, but we went a little bit more detail on that specific term, Gehenna. And we looked at a few references in the Old Testament. I'm going to just look at one right now in Jeremiah chapter 7. It says a very similar verse in Jeremiah 19 verse 6. But in Jeremiah 7 verse 32, he says, "Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will no longer be called Topheth or the valley of the son of Hinnom." And if you remember from last time, Gehenna means valley of Hinnom, a reference to this valley of the son of Hinnom, referenced a number of times in the Old Testament. It will no longer be called Topheth or the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. For they will bury in Topheth, because there is no room elsewhere. And so we compared what he says there in Jeremiah 7. It will no longer be called the valley of the son of Hinnom, but it will be called the valley of slaughter. We compared that with the Lord's words in Matthew 24. In verse 51, he says, "And I will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." The valley of slaughter, the Gehenna, the valley of the son of Hinnom, will no longer be called Gehenna. It will be called the valley of slaughter. And Jesus warns of those of his disciples. He says, "Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master will put over his household? Blessed is that servant whom the master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, I will put him over all his possessions. But if the wicked servant says to himself, 'My master is delayed,' and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and he will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites." So remember, the hypocrites were the scribes and Pharisees, and that judgment talked about in Jeremiah 7 is the rebellious among Israel, says they will be slaughtered. And Jesus is telling his disciples, when you say to your brother, Mora, if you remember last time we talked about how that's a slanderous accusation that they are in opposition to God. You're saying you are a rebel, you are opposed to God. It's very similar to what Jesus says will happen to the servant who abuses his fellow servants. I will cut him asunder and give him a portion with the hypocrites. So it seems like what Jesus is warning about when he says will be guilty enough to go into fiery Gehenna, he's talking about that end times severe judgment that will come upon servants of his that abuse his fellow servants. And so we went into much more detail about that at the study, but I just wanted to look at those couple of verses to compare to remind us of what we were talking about when he talks about that judgment of Gehenna. Once we looked at that, we then looked at the remaining section of this section on anger, verses 23 through verse 26. And I just want to read my translation of that real quick. Once again, we're loosely going through my commentary. Theirs is the Kingdom. It's a commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. But starting in verse 23, "Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come offer your gift." Now, when we talk about the judgments that Jesus was warning about, you're liable to judgment for saying to your brother, or for your anger with your brother. You're liable to the Sanhedrin for saying Raka to your brother. Guilty enough to go into Gehenna for saying Mora to your brother. When we looked at all of those judgments, the question naturally arises, is there any escape for us? Like if I've been angry with my brother, probably unjustified, or I've slandered my brother in the past. Is there any escape that I have when it comes to this coming judgment? And Jesus says, yes, there is. Like you're not condemned already, because therefore, it's like if you say this to your brother, you're guilty enough to go to the fiery Gehenna. Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember your brother has something against you. We learn later in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus is going through what's called the Lord's Prayer, where he says, if you forgive others their transgressions, your Father will also forgive you. Well, here we learn that it's also true when your brother forgives you. It affects your forgiveness with the Lord, because he's saying, if your brother has aught against you, and you want to escape this upcoming judgment, you better get reconciled with your brother today. He explains it. He goes on to explain it in kind of a parable. Let's read the rest of the section, starting in verse 25. Come to terms quickly with your accuser at law while you are with him on the way, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will never come out from there until you've paid up the last cent. So in the illustration you have, remember Jesus is saying, if your brother has aught against you, you've slandered him, or you've falsely accused him, or if you've misused him in any way, come to terms quickly while you're with him on the way. It's kind of, in the illustration, you have two people walking toward a courthouse or a judge, and they're together. He's like, you've got some time left to make reconciliation now, because once you get to the courthouse, once you get to the judge, the time for reconciliation is over. It's in the judge's hands now. And in the illustration, we today, before Jesus returns, before we stand before his judgment seat, we're with our accusers at law every day when we're together with our brothers and sisters. Come to terms quickly while you're with him on the way, while there is still time, because soon the Lord will come back and that opportunity for reconciliation will be over. I just wanted to read the last couple paragraphs of my commentary on this passage. Once again, it's from Theirs is the Kingdom. The link for it will be in the description for if you want to either purchase a copy or it's available for free online. Jesus is painting a picture of believers living together, but with offenses against one another in their hearts. While we walk together with our brothers and sisters in this life, if any of them have a genuine offense against us, then it is as though we are riding in the car with our accuser on the way to the courthouse. Jesus admonishes us, seek reconciliation now. Otherwise, like an accuser at court, once we arrive and are handed over to the judge, the time for reconciliation is over and the time of judgment begins. Notice then how important our relationships are with our fellow believers. Nothing in our lives as disciples of Christ is as important as the brothers and sisters around us. A brother's offense disrupts our fellowship with God. Yet, reconciliation with our brother not only brings about peace with men, but it is also able to restore peace and communion with the Lord himself. As disciples of Jesus, may we always remember how important the Lord considers our interactions with one another. No verbal attack, no false accusation, no internal anger harbored against a fellow believer is overlooked by the Lord. If we wish to be praised and rewarded by Jesus at his judgment seat, then we must be careful today to hold each of our brothers and sisters in the highest possible regard, loving them, caring for them, and quickly seeking restoration should we ever sin against them. Remember the words of the Apostle Paul. So then, while we have opportunity, and that phrase specifically, while we have opportunity, that's today. That's while we're with him on the way to the courthouse. Until Jesus comes back, we still have opportunity. So then, while we have opportunity, Let us work that which is good toward all, especially those of the household of faith. That's from Galatians 6, verse 10. And we talked about that last time also. There's nothing in our lives that are more important. There's nothing of eternal value that we're going to interact with on a daily basis other than the other believers that we're around. When the Apostle Paul was, Saul of Tarsus at that time, was persecuting the believers, and Jesus appears to him, he doesn't say, "Why are you persecuting my disciples?" He says, "Why are you persecuting me?" Jesus takes it very personally, the way that we interact with other believers. And so that completes this section on anger. And remember, we contrasted what Jesus' teaching was concerning anger with what the law of Moses was concerning murder. Next time, we're going to do something similar. We're going to see what the law says concerning adultery and how Jesus contrasts what the law says about adultery with his own teaching concerning lust. So looking forward to seeing you then. Thanks.